Hello and welcome to this week's Wednesday Word. Today we're going to be taking a look at Saul's conversion in Acts chapter 9. A lot of you might know Saul by Paul. It's the same person, he just changed his name after he was converted. And one of the interesting things about Saul is that he was actually a part of Stephen's execution in Acts 7, where they stoned him to death. And it says in Acts 8 chapter 1 that he approved of their killing him. And we see proof of Saul's execution of the church early on in Acts chapter 9, where it says, "He went to the high priest, and he asked him for the letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem." So Saul was actively trying to imprison Christians and people who believed in Jesus. But during his journey to Damascus, he met Jesus on the way. In verse 4 it says, "He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. 'Now get up and go into the city, and there you will be told what you must do.' The man traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes he could see nothing. So they led him by hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind, and did not eat or drink anything. Now to regain Paul's sight, there was a man named Ananias in Damascus, and the Lord went to him in a vision and told him to go look for a man from Tarsus named Saul, and to restore his vision. And Ananias was weary of this at first, because he had heard reports that Saul had persecuted the church and done harm to them, and that he was coming there to arrest them. So the Lord reassures him that Paul is his instrument that he has chosen. So Ananias goes to find Paul, or Saul, and lays his hands on him, and the scales are released, and Saul gets up and is baptized, and then has food to restore his strength. And now this next part I find really interesting, so I'm going to read halfway from Acts 9:19 through verse 22. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Yet Saul grew more and more powerful and baffled the Jews living in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. Now what I find so interesting about this is that the moment after Saul was converted, he instantly began preaching that Christ is the Messiah. And that's not necessarily the expectation for new believers, because a lot of new believers don't have that much knowledge of the faith. But Paul was a Pharisee, so he had a lot of knowledge of the Old Testament and the Old Testament law. So he had a lot of background knowledge that made it easier for him to understand, once he was converted, that Christ was the fulfillment of all the prophecies in the Old Testament that he had been studying so intently since he was a young boy and able to understand what was being preached. I don't think we realized how incredible it was that the Lord was able to use Saul, someone who persecuted the church so heavily, to be one of the great apostles and someone who wrote the majority of the books in the New Testament. But one of the things I find so inspiring about Paul is his attitude towards the gospel. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and the church in Corinth is made up of a lot of elites and very, very wealthy people that had a lot of power in the city that they're in. And Paul writes, "Already you have all that you want. Already you have become rich. You have begun to reign, and that without us. How I wish that you really had begun to reign, so that we also might reign with you. For it seems to me that God has put us, apostles, on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to human beings. We are fools for Christ, but you are so wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour, we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment." Here we see Paul's heart is completely changed from when he was a Pharisee. When he was a Pharisee, you'd be really concerned about your social standing and how much presence you have in front of other people. But here Paul says that he's become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, just so that the gospel might be proclaimed to everyone. Later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk?" And here he's talking about the right that preachers have to be compensated for the work that they do. But Paul says, we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. And that doesn't mean that Pastor Tim shouldn't be compensated for what he does, but it's merely Paul saying that he's putting up with anything so that the gospel of Christ is unhindered and going out to the world. And again, this idea of totally surrendering himself to Christ so that he could preach the gospel to anyone would have been totally antithetical to what he believed as a Pharisee, where he would have been too holy or have too much standing to talk with these people who were prostitutes and who were tax collectors. But instead, he was able to preach the gospel to them because he was dedicated to Christ and he wasn't so worried about his social standing. And this is just more evidence that God can change a person and change them severely to use them for his own purposes. While we can't be Paul because we're not apostles and we can't write books of the Bible, we can follow his example. He did say in 1 Corinthians to be imitators of me. So we can follow his example and some of the ways that he thought about sacrifice and not hindering the gospel. So while we might not be giving up everything so that we can preach the gospel, we can still look at ways in our life that we might be hindering the gospel from going out to others, things that we're doing that are not fruitful for spreading the gospel. Or maybe we are too puffed up and need to be humbled like Paul was humbled and completely submitted to Christ. These are just two examples of how Paul's mindset changed from being a Pharisee to when he was converted and became a Christian. And there's plenty of other ways that we can learn in the Bible from other characters about how our thinking should change after we are converted, or how our submission to Christ should really look. So that's all I got for this week's Wednesday Word. I hope we can learn from Paul's change in heart and change in attitude and learn something about sacrificing ourselves for the gospel's sake, or about humbling ourselves for the gospel's sake.